will find a way.
Alina had finally arrived, but some secrets are best left buried. There was no turning back now. Alina knew that entering this house would change everything. But for Nora's sake, she had to try. Little did she know she was walking into a trap.
If you're watching this, I'd love to get to know you. Please comment your location and the time below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for being here today. I will find a way.
Alina Marsh had $11 in her checking account, a 6-year-old daughter asleep in the back seat of a car that wouldn't pass inspection again, and an eviction notice with a date circled on it that was now 9 days away. The only job left on the entire staffing agency's list was live-in care for a man named Walter Ashcroft, 74 years old, worth more money than Alina could properly picture in her head, and dying slowly, of a heart that had been failing him for 2 years. 14 caregivers had taken that same position in the preceding 6 months. None of them had lasted longer than 3 weeks. The house had exactly one rule, printed in bold at the top of the contract, underlined twice. No children on the property, under any circumstances. Alina had nowhere else for her daughter, Nora, to actually be. So she signed the contract, and she brought her anyway, hiding a 6-year-old in the back of a housekeeping cart on her very first morning, praying the coldest man in the entire county wouldn't notice a small girl with a box of crayons sitting quietly in the corner of his study. He noticed within the hour. Alina was certain, standing in that hallway waiting to be fired on her very first day, that she'd just lost the only job standing between her daughter and a shelter. What actually happened, over the following 6 months, was something nobody in that house, not the household staff, not Walter's own attorney, not even Walter himself, ever once saw coming. Before I tell you exactly how a crayon drawing ended up taped to a dying man's wall for the rest of his life, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I promise you this story is worth staying for all the way through. Like this video if you believe small, unpaid kindness is the most powerful force in the world. Share it with somebody who needs a reminder that showing up matters more than anything else. And drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to understand exactly who Walter Ashcroft had been before grief turned him into the man 14 caregivers couldn't survive working for. Walter Ashcroft built Ashcroft Maritime Logistics from a single leased cargo vessel into one of the largest privately held shipping companies on the eastern seaboard. A fortune he'd spent nearly 5 decades constructing with a discipline and intensity that colleagues, throughout his working life, both admired and quietly found exhausting to be around. He hadn't always been the cold, closed-off man 14 caregivers had recently failed to tolerate. Those who'd known him in his 30s before this story's central tragedy described a genuinely warm, engaged man, deeply devoted to his wife, Eleanor, and to their only son Peter, a bright, gentle 7-year-old who had, by every account, been the actual center of Walter's entire world throughout the boy's short life. Peter died of a rapidly progressing illness that no doctor in 1987 could adequately treat in time, a loss that arrived with a swiftness Walter had never fully recovered from. Even decades later, he buried his son, and within the following year he buried alongside him every visible trace of the warm, present father he'd once been, throwing himself instead into building Ashcroft Maritime with an intensity that colleagues understood, even at the time, as a man trying desperately to outrun a grief he had no idea how to actually sit with. Eleanor stayed married to Walter for another 11 years following Peter's death, though those close to the family described their marriage during that period as two people sharing a house rather than a genuine partnership, Walter's emotional withdrawal having become, by then, an immovable, permanent fixture of his character. Eleanor passed away from cancer 16 years before this story begins, and Walter, by that point, had already spent so long inside his own carefully constructed isolation, that even his wife's death barely seemed to shift the walls he'd built around himself. Walter's heart condition, a slow, progressive form of congestive heart failure, was diagnosed just over 2 years before the story's central events, a diagnosis that required, according to his physicians, full-time live-in care to properly manage his medications, monitor his declining condition, and assist with the daily tasks his failing heart made increasingly difficult to manage independently. What followed was a remarkable, well-documented pattern within Savannah's private caregiving community. 14 qualified, experienced caregivers hired over the following 18 months, none of them lasting longer than 3 weeks before either resigning outright or being dismissed by Walter himself. A pattern that had made his household staffing agency increasingly reluctant to send anyone new at all. Walter's difficulty wasn't rooted in any genuine cruelty toward the caregivers themselves, though his behavior often produced exactly that effect. It was rooted instead in a specific, calcified defensiveness that had calcified around his own unprocessed grief for so many decades that any genuine warmth or connection now registered to Walter's own guarded instincts as a threat requiring immediate, sharp deflection. His household staff, particularly his longtime housekeeper, Marguerite, who had worked for the family since before Peter's death and remained one of the only people Walter still tolerated with any consistency, had grown increasingly worried about his isolation, understanding, better than nearly anyone else remaining in his life, exactly how much genuine loneliness sat underneath his carefully maintained coldness. Alina Marsh had been working steadily as a home health aide across the greater Savannah area for nearly 6 years, building a genuinely solid professional reputation despite the specific financial precarity that had defined most of her adult life as a single mother. Her circumstances had grown considerably more urgent over the preceding 4 months, following the sudden closure of the assisted living facility where she'd previously held steady employment, a closure that left her cycling through short-term, unstable placements while her modest savings dwindled steadily against rent she could no longer reliably cover. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, giving Alina exactly 14 days to either pay the considerable balance she'd fallen behind on or vacate the small apartment she shared with her 6-year-old daughter, Nora, a bright, endlessly curious little girl who had, throughout her short life, already weathered considerably more instability than any child her age should reasonably have to navigate. Alina's staffing agency mentioned the Ashcroft position almost apologetically, warning her honestly about its difficult reputation before she'd even finished reading the posting. A warning Alina absorbed with the particular calm of someone who had run entirely out of other viable options. "I don't have anywhere else for my daughter to be during my shifts," Alina told the agency coordinator honestly, laying out her genuinely difficult circumstances. "I don't have family in the area. I don't have the money for consistent childcare. I need this position, and I need a way to keep my daughter safely with me while I work it." The coordinator, sympathetic but bound by the position's strict, explicit no children policy, could offer no accommodation. Alina took the job anyway, and made a decision, driving to the Ashcroft estate for her first shift, that would define the entire remainder of this story. Alina brought Nora with her on that first morning, settling her daughter quietly in a small utility room near the estate's kitchen with a box of crayons and a stack of blank paper, instructing her, with the careful seriousness of a mother who understood exactly how much rode on this particular gamble, to stay quiet and out of sight for as long as possible. Nora, for her part, managed exactly 40 minutes of quiet compliance before her own natural curiosity carried her, crayons in hand, down a long hallway toward Walter's private study, drawn by nothing more complicated than a child's simple desire to explore an unfamiliar, enormous house. Walter, seated at his desk reviewing shipping contracts he barely had the energy to properly focus on given his declining health, looked up to find a small girl standing quietly in his doorway, watching him with the same open, unguarded curiosity most children brought to encountering an unfamiliar adult. "Who are you?" Walter asked, his voice carrying the same sharp, immediate irritation that had driven off 14 previous caregivers within their first few days. "I'm Nora," the little girl said, entirely unbothered by his tone in a way that visibly caught Walter off guard. "My mommy works here now. I like your big window. Can I draw it?" Walter, for reasons he couldn't have fully articulated even to himself in that exact moment, didn't immediately order her removed. He simply stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, something complicated and painful moving behind his own guarded expression, before finally, quietly, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Fine," he said. Quietly. Alina discovered her daughter's absence from the utility room roughly 10 minutes later, a discovery that sent her into an immediate, controlled panic as she moved quickly through the unfamiliar house, understanding with painful clarity exactly what consequence awaited her if Nora's presence violated the estate's explicit, non-negotiable rule. She found Nora in Walter's study, quietly drawing at a small side table while Walter himself sat at his desk nearby, his attention split, with visible discomfort, between his contracts and the small girl occupying his previously undisturbed private space. "Mr. Ashcroft, I am so sorry," Alina said immediately, crossing the room quickly to retrieve her daughter. "This won't happen again. Please, I need this position. I'll find another arrangement for her starting tomorrow. She's fine," Walter said, cutting off Alina's rushed apology with a gruffness that nonetheless carried something Alina couldn't quite immediately identify. "She's not causing any trouble." Alina stood there, genuinely confused, having fully expected immediate termination rather than this strange, guarded permission. "Sir, the contract was explicit about no children on the property. I don't want to create any problems for you." "The contract," Walter said, his voice carrying a specific, weary bitterness, "was written by people who don't actually understand what problems in this house look like. Leave her. I have work to finish." Alina left her daughter in that study with considerable, lingering uncertainty, unable to fully process exactly what had just happened, or exactly why the coldest man in Savannah's private caregiving community had just quietly overturned his own household's strictest rule. Nora spent the remainder of that first day quietly drawing in the corner of Walter's study, occasionally asking simple, direct questions he found himself, to his own considerable surprise, actually answering rather than deflecting the way he'd deflected every previous attempt at genuine conversation from his adult caregivers. She left, at the end of that first day, a drawing propped carefully on the edge of his desk, a simple, childlike rendering of his study's large bay window, the ocean visible beyond it rendered in the confident, uncomplicated blue only a 6-year-old could manage without any self-consciousness. Walter looked at that drawing for a long time after Alina and Nora had left for the evening, alone in his study with an unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling he eventually, reluctantly identified as something considerably closer to genuine warmth than he'd allowed himself to feel in longer than he cared to calculate. He didn't throw the drawing away. He set it, instead, in the top drawer of his desk, telling himself it was simple practicality, nothing more, though he found himself, over the following several days, returning to look at it more than he was entirely comfortable acknowledging even to himself. Nora returned the following morning, and the morning after that, gradually becoming, over the following 2 weeks, an established quiet presence in Walter's study each day. A presence he found himself, gradually and against every defensive instinct he'd spent decades cultivating, genuinely looking forward to rather than merely tolerating. Walter never fully explained, even to Alina directly, exactly why he'd overturned his own household's strict rules so immediately and so completely for her daughter specifically, though Marguerite, watching this unusual dynamic develop with her own careful, long-time understanding of Walter's history, understood considerably more than either Walter or Alina yet realized about what was actually happening. "She's the same age Peter was," Marguerite told Alina quietly, roughly 3 weeks into this new, unexpected arrangement, during a rare private moment between the two women in the estate's kitchen. "Same age near enough. I don't think Mr. Ashcroft has let himself be in a room with a child that age since his own son passed, 38 years ago now." Alina absorbed that information with a specific, careful gravity, understanding for the first time, exactly what kind of profound, decades-old grief her daughter's simple, unguarded presence had apparently begun to crack open in a man everyone else in his life had long since given up trying to reach. Walter himself, in the rare moments he allowed himself any genuine reflection on the matter, understood, with a clarity he found simultaneously painful and unexpectedly relieving, that Nora's presence in his study each day had become the first genuine, sustained comfort he'd allowed himself in nearly 4 decades of carefully guarded isolation. "She doesn't want anything from me," Walter admitted once, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty with Marguerite. "Everyone else who's ever spent time in this house over the past 30 years has wanted something. My money, my company, my approval. She just wants to draw pictures of my window and ask why the ocean looks different every day. I'd forgotten what that kind of presence even felt like. The following months brought a gradual, genuine transformation in Walter's demeanor that Marguerite and the estate's remaining staff watched unfold with a mixture of relief and quiet astonishment. A thaw that extended, gradually, beyond simply his relationship with Nora into a broader, if still guarded, warmth toward Alina herself. Walter began asking Alina genuine questions about her own life during their daily interactions, questions that moved gradually beyond the strictly clinical caregiving relationship the position technically required into something considerably more personal. Her own background, her hopes for Nora's future, the specific circumstances that had brought her to his door in such genuine desperation only weeks earlier. He began, too, gradually allowing himself small moments of genuine engagement with Nora beyond simply tolerating her presence, answering her endless questions with real patience, occasionally even attempting, with visible rustiness, a kind of gentle humor Marguerite hadn't witnessed from him since long before Peter's death. He asked me yesterday what my favorite color was, Nora told her mother one evening, with the simple, matter-of-fact delight of a child who had no idea how significant that small exchange actually represented for the man asking the question. I told him purple. He said Peter liked purple too. Who's Peter, Mommy? Alina, understanding immediately the significance of what her daughter had just shared, felt her own eyes fill with tears, recognizing with painful clarity exactly how much healing that simple exchange likely represented for a man who apparently hadn't spoken his own son's name aloud in decades. Roughly 4 months into Alina's employment, during a routine afternoon organizing paperwork in Walter's home office at his own increasingly trusting request, Alina discovered a series of financial documents that immediately, uncomfortably raised her concern. The documents, part of a folder Walter's nephew and estate manager, Preston Ashcroft, had left carelessly accessible during a recent visit, revealed a pattern of unusual transfers from several of Walter's investment accounts into entities Alina didn't recognize, transfers that had accelerated considerably over the preceding 6 months, coinciding, she noted with growing alarm, almost exactly with the period of Walter's declining physical health. She also found, tucked within that same folder, a partially drafted letter addressed to Walter's longtime attorney, written in Preston's own handwriting, requesting a formal evaluation of Walter's current mental competency, language that, combined with the suspicious financial transfers, painted an increasingly troubling picture of exactly what Preston appeared to be quietly orchestrating. Alina sat with that discovery for a long, difficult evening, understanding clearly the considerable risk involved in raising these concerns. Risk to her own employment, risk to the fragile, unprecedented trust she'd built with Walter over the preceding months, risk, given Preston's own social standing within the family, of being dismissed entirely as an overstepping employee rather than someone genuinely trying to protect a vulnerable man from his own family's exploitation. She decided, despite every one of those very real risks, that she couldn't simply remain silent. Alina requested a private conversation with Walter the following morning, choosing her words with considerable care, understanding exactly how delicate this particular conversation needed to be, given both the seriousness of what she'd discovered and her own precarious position within his household. Mr. Ashcroft, I found some documents yesterday that I think you need to see, Alina said, placing the folder carefully on his desk. I want to be honest that I know this isn't my place, and I understand if raising this costs me my position here. But I couldn't in good conscience simply say nothing. Walter reviewed the documents with a growing, visible alarm, his own careful business instincts, still sharp despite his declining health, immediately recognizing exactly what pattern those transfers and that draft letter actually represented. Preston, Walter said quietly, more to himself than to Alina, processing a betrayal that clearly cut considerably deeper than simple financial concern. My own brother's son, trying to have me declared incompetent while quietly emptying my accounts in the meantime. He looked up at Alina, his expression carrying a specific, raw vulnerability she hadn't yet witnessed from him throughout their preceding months together. You didn't have to bring me this. You could have simply stayed quiet and protected your own position here. I couldn't do that, sir, Alina said simply. Not after everything you and Nora have built together these past few months. I wasn't going to let someone exploit that just because staying quiet would have been easier for me. Walter moved swiftly once he'd fully absorbed the scope of Preston's apparent scheme, contacting his longtime attorney directly, a man who had represented the Ashcroft family's interests for over 30 years and who confirmed, within days of reviewing the documents Alina had discovered, exactly the troubling pattern she'd first identified. Preston's financial mismanagement, once properly investigated, revealed transfers totaling just over $3 million diverted into accounts Preston controlled personally, alongside clear evidence that he had, in fact, begun quietly building a legal case to have Walter declared mentally incompetent. A case built on selectively presented, misleading accounts of Walter's health struggles rather than any genuine, accurate assessment of his actual cognitive capacity. Walter's attorney moved immediately to freeze the relevant accounts and formally remove Preston from his position as estate manager, alongside pursuing both civil recovery of the diverted funds and, ultimately, criminal fraud charges that would result, over the following year, in Preston's formal conviction and a considerable restitution order. Walter, in the immediate aftermath of this discovery, found himself confronting not simply his nephew's specific betrayal, but a broader, painful reckoning with exactly how isolated his decades of guarded grief had left him. Isolated enough that a family member had apparently felt confident he could quietly exploit that isolation without any meaningful risk of discovery, had Alina not chosen, at real personal risk, to intervene. The uncovering of Preston's betrayal, painful as it was, produced an unexpected secondary effect in Walter. A specific, cracking open of the emotional walls he'd maintained for nearly 4 decades, walls that Nora's simple, consistent presence had already begun quietly eroding over the preceding months. Walter spoke of Peter directly for the first time in decades during a quiet evening conversation with Alina roughly 2 weeks after Preston's scheme was fully exposed, describing, with a raw vulnerability that clearly cost him considerable effort, the specific joy and eventual devastating loss of his son. Memories he'd apparently kept so thoroughly locked away that even articulating them now felt, in his own words, like learning to speak a language I'd forgotten I once knew fluently. I built an entire empire trying to outrun losing him, Walter admitted, tears falling freely in a way Marguerite would later say she hadn't witnessed from him even at Eleanor's own funeral. I told myself for 38 years that staying closed off to everyone was simply who I'd become. I understand now it was never actually who I was. It was just the only way I knew how to survive losing him. Alina listened to that admission with the same steady, careful presence she'd brought to every previous interaction with Walter, understanding, with a clarity that moved her considerably, exactly how significant this moment of genuine grief actually represented for a man who had spent nearly 4 decades refusing to let himself fully feel it. Nora reminds you of him, Alina said gently, not quite a question. She reminds me of exactly what I lost the ability to feel, the day he died, Walter said. She brought it back. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly explain what that's actually worth to me. Walter, in the weeks following both Preston's exposure and his own profound emotional breakthrough regarding Peter, made a specific, deliberate decision about exactly how he wanted to acknowledge everything Alina and Nora had brought back into his life. I want to formally provide for both of you, Walter told Alina, during a conversation he'd clearly prepared for carefully. Not simply your continued salary, though that will certainly continue. I want to establish a trust that ensures neither you nor Nora ever again face the kind of desperation that brought you to my door in the first place. Whatever amount feels appropriate to you. Alina, genuinely moved by the offer, responded with the same grounded, unpretentious honesty that had characterized her entire approach throughout her time in his household. Mr. Ashcroft, I didn't do any of this hoping for money. I need you to understand that clearly. What I actually need, more than any amount you could offer, is simply stable housing for my daughter and steady work. That's genuinely all I've ever wanted. Walter honored that specific request precisely, purchasing a modest, comfortable home for Alina and Nora in a good Savannah school district, alongside formalizing Alina's position within his household with a level of security and compensation considerably beyond what she'd have found nearly anywhere else, while carefully respecting her explicit wish not to be given some enormous, life-altering sum that felt, to her, disconnected from the genuine relationship that had actually developed between their small family and his. Walter's heart condition continued its slow, steady decline over the following several months, though those final months, by every account from Marguerite and Alina alike, carried a genuine peace and warmth entirely absent from the years immediately preceding Nora's arrival in his life. Nora continued visiting his study each day throughout that final stretch, her drawings gradually filling an entire wall near his bed as his own physical capacity to move through the larger house diminished, each new picture a small, consistent thread of genuine joy running through his declining final months. Walter passed away peacefully in his own home 8 months after Alina first brought her daughter through his door in quiet, desperate violation of his household's strictest rule. Surrounded, in his final days, by Marguerite, by Alina, and by Nora herself, who had by that point become as genuinely important to him as any biological family member could have been. His will, finalized in the weeks before his death, formally established the trust he'd promised Alina, alongside a considerable philanthropic foundation focused specifically on supporting single mothers facing housing insecurity, work he described, in a personal letter left for Alina, as the only meaningful way I know to make sure what happened in my own house, when a desperate mother had nowhere else left to turn, happens for other families too, before it ever becomes quite this dire. Walter's heart condition continued its slow, steady decline over the following several months, though those final months, by every account from Marguerite and Alina alike, carried a genuine peace and warmth entirely absent from the years immediately preceding Nora's arrival in his life. Nora continued visiting his study each day throughout that final stretch, her drawings gradually filling an entire wall near his bed as his own physical capacity to move through the larger house diminished, each new picture a small, consistent thread of genuine joy running through his declining final months. Walter passed away peacefully in his own home 8 months after Alina first brought her daughter through his door in quiet, desperate violation of his household's strictest rule. Surrounded, in his final days, by Marguerite, by Alina, and by Nora herself, who had by that point become as genuinely important to him as any biological family member could have been. His will, finalized in the weeks before his death, formally established the trust he'd promised Alina, alongside a considerable philanthropic foundation focused specifically on supporting single mothers facing housing insecurity, work he described, in a personal letter left for Alina, as the only meaningful way I know to make sure what happened in my own house, when a desperate mother had nowhere else left to turn, happens for other families too, before it ever becomes quite this dire.